I am Bryan Sitzes. I'm a third year PhD student at the University of Texas at Austin in the Department for Middle Eastern Studies here. I do modern Iranian history, but I also am interested in modern Persianate history. So, what we now call Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, these sorts of places. Kamran Aghai is my advisor, but I also work with Mikia Koyagi. Since I'm interested in environmental history, I work with Megan Raby, who is a Latin Americanist, but she's one of our main environmental history people here, and I actually really like working with someone who's familiar, with a different part of the world. I am a coordinator for the refugee student mentor program we have here, since Austin is an entry point for a lot of refugee and asylee families. So we recruit university students with the appropriate language skills, Arabic, Kinyarwanda, Dari or Farsi, and we send them into the local schools, the kindergarten through high school, and they help newly arrived students sort of adjust themselves to their new surroundings. We really, really need Pashto speaking volunteers because that is like maybe the plurality of students are from Afghanistan and speak Pashto, but it's just really hard to find, Pashto speaking volunteers. So that's pretty much who I am.
If anyone is a Pashto speaker listening to this, please get in
That's
touch.
kind of why I said it.
No,
To get a random
you never
recruit.
know. Yeah, I mean, I hope you find some people. That's incredible, and thank you for that great introduction. And what led you to these interests? What led you to study Iran and the Persianate world?
Well, I mean, Iran generally is sort of a longer story, but I guess back in undergrad was when the 2009 presidential election happened. And so, the interest was sort of drawn at that point. But I was going to a small college. We had one professor there who sort of specialized in Middle Eastern history, and it wasn't Iranian history. So I left and was in the workforce for several years. And then I had a friend, Kaveh Basiri, who does poetry translation and writes poetry. And he told me, if you want to do Iranian studies, you should go to Texas. And so I came here, I did my master's here as well in the Center for Middle Eastern Studies. And so, you learn very quickly that doing history, we want you to get out of this, nation state framework, and, histories of Iran as a discrete unit. And so you're trying to think, well, how can I get outside of this framework? And Dr. Sami Ayub here at UT, and then my friend Andrew Aglaki, they both told me, well, there's this thing called environmental history that you can do, and that's a really good way to sort of break outside of that framework. So that's how I got interested in that. I wrote my master's thesis on the American developmental project in Khuzestan in the 50s and 60s. Yeah, they built the Des Dam there. I know there's some other people working on it at that point. I took a chapter from that thesis and adapted it to publish in the special edition of Iranian Studies on public health. And so that's where that came from, because these public health programs are often a part of the sort of irrigation reworking programs too, with that stuff. So that's the story of how I got into that.
Great.
But now I'm thinking more about the sort of the development in Iran over the course of the 20th century of like, what is the environment? How to think about society's relationship with natural resources and things like that. And I had come across at some point this magazine, Shikara Tabiat, that began to be published in the late 1950s by the Kanun Shikara Iran, or basically the Game Council of Iran. And this magazine is a lot of it's about hunting. They try to teach you, how do you shoot correctly, what should you wear, things like that. But they also have a lot of articles. I mean, I think the third issue, so right at the beginning, is has an article entitled, why we believe conservation of natural resources should be
Mm.
like doctrine of religion. Um, and this sort of impetus, I think, comes from the participation of Eskandari Firuz, who was
Mm-hmm.
a part of this Qanun. He's considered like the grandfather of modern Iranian environmentalism. Unfortunately,
Mm.
he just passed away this year.
Oh,
Um,
oh dear.
so that's a really interesting source that I've been working with. But you
Mm.
know, the environmental history of Iran and a sort of region is such a relatively new
Mm-hmm.
subject that there are
Mm.
so many things that you can do with it. I mean, it's
Mm.
wide open. If you're
Yes.
interested in modernization, nation state
Mm.
formation, I know you interviewed somebody else who was interested in international law.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Um, and so, like in 1972, Iran hosted the Ramsar Convention, which is an international wetlands protection convention.
Ah.
And even just doing a social history of that convention in Iran, or there's so many other things you could do with it. Uh,
Mm.
they quickly got tied up with UNESCO and all sorts of other United Nations
Mm-hmm.
organizations. So someone could go into the United Nations archives and
Sure.
probably get some really interesting stuff out of there. Um, Knowledge
Mm.
production, sort of, if people are familiar with Jennifer Durr's new book, The Lived Nile, on
Mm-hmm.
19th century, um, like 19th century Egyptian history. This is sort of what I'm related to, or what
Mm-hmm.
I'm interested in with knowledge production. If you're interested in
Mm.
changing gender roles in Iranian
Mm-hmm.
society, there's
Mm-hmm.
really interesting stuff to do with environment. Like in this magazine I'm looking at, Iranian women almost never appear. Uh, you
Mm.
you know, it's a very masculine magazine. If women do appear, they're very sort of idealized, drawn out women in advertisements for sewing machines, or things like that. Or
That's
there will
amazing.
be yeah, or there'll be a comic, where the
Mm.
hunter comes home and his wife is giving him grief about hunting. Or it will be, American or European women. If a woman is shown being outdoors and doing, outdoor sports and things like that, it's a European or American woman.
Oh,
Or if you
fascinating.
want to bring in race into it,
Mm-hmm.
race in the modern Middle East, um, there are a lot of articles on Africa, and they
Mm-hmm.
show them, in a very stereotypical mid 20th century National Geographic Into the Heart of Darkness kind of framing.
Right. Yeah.
Uh, so thinking
Wow.
about, ideas of blackness in modern Iran, you could look at that stuff too.
Mm-hmm.
I could go on,
No,
but
no, it's fascinating just to hear it because it's a field that, I mean, as a historian of Iran, I embarrassingly know so little of. And it's so exciting hearing this because you're right, it's such a vast field that we've largely ignored. So it's incredible.
yeah, well,
Yeah, please go
thankfully
on.
it is changing. Arash Khazini has had several things come out. He just came out with a new book this year about, and related to this sort of Iran Southeast Asia
Mm,
relations. I can't
mhm,
remember what the book is called off
mhm.
the top of my head, but he and other people have been doing things. But as much work as there has been done, there's so much more to do that I think it's
Yeah,
very exciting.
it is very
And I would love to
exciting.
talk to anybody who's interested, in
Yeah.
incorporating environmental studies into their work.
No,
Yeah.
I think it's the future because when we think of natural resources with Iran, we immediately think oil, but there is so much more out there.
Yeah, I mean, if you think of desertification is
Hmm.
a big problem, and that is something. I mean, back in the Pahlavi period, they are trying to plant trees and things like that. Things that you see
Hmm.
the Islamic Republic doing now. And
Mm.
that's actually another aspect of this problem that interests me. You have people like Kevin Harris,
Mm-hmm.
whose book showed, the sort of continuities between Pahlavi social policies and similar policies of the Islamic Republic. There are things that the Sazman Hefazat Mohit
Mm-hmm.
Zist, Department of Environment in the Islamic Republic does now, that the Pahlavi state at least talked about doing,
Mm,
in the 50s and 60s.
I see.
So yeah, desertification, deforestation. I know that um, gosh, again, I'm blanking, but there is an academic who is working on a monograph on the history of
Wow.
forestry in Iran.
Okay.
Sagar Sadeghi, I think.
Okay.
Um,
I'm not 100% sure myself.
and then if you think of like obviously air pollution in Tehran
Of course.
or
Yes.
dust
Yeah.
storms in Khuzestan, these are
Mm,
not new problems either. People have been talking
no.
about this for a long time. And then I
Right.
think the last thing that I'll say about that, obviously earthquakes are huge problems,
Mm-hmm.
even forest fires. If you watch documentaries on Iranian forestry now, they'll talk about charcoal makers, people illegally going into the forest and cutting down trees to make charcoal.
Wow.
Um,
Okay.
this is again another problem that they're talking about in like the early issues of Shikar al-Tabiat as a
Mm,
problem for deforestation. So it's not old.
mm.
Or I think if you watched even the Iranian film, one of my favorite Iranian films, The Color of Paradise, I
Oh,
think.
yes, of course. Yeah,
I guess
yeah.
I think they make charcoal in that film, if I recall
Oh,
correctly.
maybe. My memory is a little bit hazy, but that's
Yeah,
possible. It's possible. Yeah. Beautiful film though.
yeah.
Okay, interesting. And so, I mean, what does your PhD look at exactly? Do you use these magazines as your main source? What are you looking at exactly?
Yeah, so there's in the North American context, there's a really large literature, sort of an intellectual history on what is environmentalism, what does it
Mm-hmm.
mean, and all
Yeah.
that. Um, and there's, as far as I can tell, there's some tangential work on that in relation to Iran. Um, there's a Japanese anthropology student in the early 2000s, Satoshi Abe, who wrote about people park relationships and things like that. But basically, I want with this dissertation at this point, we'll see how things change as time goes on.
Things always develop. That's the nice
But
part about it.
to look at the dynamics of, how Iranians are talking about the non-human environment and the sort of
Mm-hmm.
human environment relation.
Okay.
Um,
Okay.
a lot of things, especially if you look at it, they'll just use the word environment or nature and not interrogate what that actually means, right? And
Mm-hmm.
then if you look
Mm-hmm.
at the field of Islam and ecology or Islam and the environment, even a lot of people don't really interrogate these sort of Euro-American derived terms either.
Mm-hmm.
And so thinking about terms like tabiat, these terms that actually correlate pretty well with Euro-American terms like nature, but there are slight differences. So
Mm,
I guess
okay.
sort of an intellectual history,
Mm,
but I would
interesting.
like to be able to bring in, actual social history into it.
Mm-hmm.
There are things that people have looked at before, like Cyrus Shayev wrote about, say, the construction of the Karaj Dam. But,
Right? Oh, okay.
how did
Yeah.
people who lived in villages where that
Mm,
dam now stands, who had to move, was their sort of social history and things like that.
yeah.
So,
Mm. How were they displaced? Yeah, yeah.
try to do a sort of, history from below kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
I guess my problem generally is that I have these grand plans of like everything that I want to do, and
Yeah.
Kamran is really good at giving me enough space to let me go out and try to do that, and then I
Mm-hmm.
realize sort of on my own that it's a bit unreasonable, and I'll tone it down. But
Mm,
I guess generally that's the idea for the dissertation is,
mm,
how are Iranians rethinking ideas of the environment? or even
Mm.
like I was watching another one of your interviews with your very first interview. I think she writes on literature.
Oh
Interested
yes,
in
Julia Hartley, maybe.
That's right. She
Yeah.
mentioned her interest in romanticism,
Yes.
and you have figures like Nima Yushij, who
Hmm.
are critical for 20th century changes in Iranian poetry and literature.
Hmm.
And something that I had read earlier this year was that I guess Nima actually attended a French school, I think, or had a French teacher in Iran when he was younger. And
Right.
this teacher was closely connected with the Romantic school back in
Ah.
France. Or you have even someone like Muhammad Iqbal, who's
Hmm.
Pakistan or South Asian, you know,
Hmm.
um, but obviously read in Iran.
Hmm.
And he has also the way that he writes about the non-human environment, um, you can see very clear parallels with intellectual developments in the
Mm,
UK and Europe and things at that
right.
time.
That's very
And so that
interesting.
it's another interesting way to think about pathways of knowledge flows, right? Because I want to get out
Mm,
of, and if you think about Iran in an international context, but
hmm.
not then just immediately going to Europe or North America.
Hmm.
So what are the
Hmm.
sort of South-South ties,
Yeah.
or things like
Hmm.
that?
Links with the Indonesian Malay world as well. I think there was a lot of knowledge flow going that way. No,
Hmm.
it's fascinating. It's very, very interesting. Very exciting. I'm looking forward to seeing where you take your research. Looks like it could go anywhere, which is what's so
Yeah,
exciting about it.
and it'll be a few
Um,
years. So.
no, take your time. You should take your time and enjoy the process. I think that's the main thing. And so far, what have been your main surprises and challenges studying Iran and the Persianate world?
Yeah, I was thinking about this, and I mean, as far as surprises go, I guess I'm surprised every day, with something that I
I
read.
think that's normal with Iran.
Yeah, and so that's one of the things that I really like about it, and I feel really lucky to sort of be doing what I'm doing. Um, but as far as challenges go, I think the main one is the one that we all face with
Mm,
access to Iran,
yeah.
and being able to go to Iran. Um, I actually I did go to Iran in
Oh.
2015,
Mm-hmm.
just before I entered the master's program, but I was just there as a tourist. I wasn't doing any
No,
research or
that's
anything.
fine. But
But
at
like
least
you
you got to
think
go.
exactly.
Yeah.
Um, but you think even if you didn't get into the archives, just getting
Mm.
into the secondary literature of
Mm.
what people have written there,
Mm-hmm.
sometimes just for fun, I go to the websites of different Iranian universities to
Mm-hmm.
see sort of what their environmental studies programs look like, or
That's
any
smart.
sort of work like that.
Right.
And at Shahid Beheshti University,
Right.
I found a 38-page PDF of a sort of suggested reading list or resources that their students can draw upon for who are interested in environmental studies. And
Mm-hmm.
so it would be interesting to think, like sort of Varzani's book on the history of education and history
Mm-hmm.
writing in Iran in the
Mm-hmm.
early
Mm-hmm.
20th century.
Mm-hmm.
So like looking at textbooks, it would be
Mm-hmm.
interesting to see, what is the history of environmental studies textbooks that people are
Yeah.
looking
Sure.
on.
That's
But
true.
most
Yeah.
most of the stuff on that list I can't access, because I'm in, you could maybe
Right.
finagle a way to get some copies of something to you, but for the
Mm.
amount of literature that you need, or like
So difficult. Yeah.
if you want to contact someone in Iran,
Mm.
if I just contact them out of the blue and they don't know who I am, uh,
Yeah.
it's not that they might not contact you back; they won't contact you back because I've done
Mm.
it and I haven't heard back from anyone. Um, like
Oh
there's
dear.
a
Yeah.
guy, Abdul Hussein Vahabzadeh. He
Mm-hmm.
translated, or he published a translation of Rachel Carson's Silent Spring in 1979. So when the revolution happened,
Wow.
uh, Carson's book is sort of credited as one of the big forces for making the popular environmental movement in the United States happen. And
Mm,
so if you wanted to do like a reception studies thing of Rachel Carson's Silent Spring or things like that,
mhm,
you would want to talk to someone like him, but
mm,
it's just a little bit difficult. So that's the
I
main
see.
challenge. We'll see how
Yeah.
things change in the future. We hope for the best.
Inshallah, as they say.
Inshallah.
And as a final question, I mean, I know you're still early on in your program, but do you have any plans for the future? Are you considering staying on in academia? I know it's a bit of a tough question because we're all in the same boat. But what
Mhm.
are your thoughts?
Well, academia is definitely plan A. I would love to do it. Um,
Yeah,
but I'm also at the same time trying not to put all my eggs in one basket and trying to
yeah.
think of, what are the other possibilities. So, an important thing for me is community engagement,
Mm-hmm.
sort of getting outside the quote unquote ivory tower. So, even if I
Sure.
did stay in academia, I would want to be involved in programs with the community, like with this
Mm.
refugee
Like what you're doing now.
mentor
Yeah.
program. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So, if I had to leave academia, um, I would be interested in, like, you know, there are all sorts of things like that, nonprofit work that you can do,
Mm,
and
absolutely.
other things. Yeah.
Yeah. No, it sounds like you're on the right path. I mean, I wish you all the best, Brian, and thank you so much for speaking to me. I feel like I've learned a lot, but it's also highlighted just so much that we can do in the field of Iranian studies and in the wider Persianate world. So incredible chat. Thank you so much. Thank you
Thank
for
you,
your
Rowena,
time.
for inviting me. I really enjoyed it.